Hello everyone. In this video, we are going to talk about how to migrate to Riverpod step by step using various refactoring technique while using test as a safety net. So let's get started. So let's install Riverpod. So I'll just search Riverpod here, and there is already a riverpod.dev website, and there are some other tutorial as well. So let's just go to the Riverpod website. So this is the first example we have. So we just wanted to get started. And if you come across here, so there are three type of packages here, basically a Flutter Riverpod, Hooks Riverpod, and Riverpod, which is basically Dart only. So we are not going to use Hook Riverpod. We just want our Riverpod for Flutter app. So we'll just go to here. So this is the pub.dev where I can go to installing, and I just need copy this and go to my pubs.yaml file, paste it here. I'll just remove this dependency and I'll just do flutter.get. So this will install the So the Flutter SDK is 2.3, the Riverpod required this. So what we'll do is, for our demo sake, we'll just increase it to the dev one. I'll just do again. So yeah, now it's working because I have resolved the version conflict. Now let's go to our main page here. Now, so basically you can go through the example in order to understand how it works, but I have already been through that example. So I'll just get right away into the API. So in order to use a Riverpod, you need to have some dependency. You have to define a dependency, which is basically called a provider. And then you use that provider throughout the widget, get the current and updated state, or use that instance. So first we need to create a provider with a dependency, which is in our case is called app database. So let's create that dependency. So we'll create by using final app database provider, and then we'll use a provider class, which is you can see coming from Flutter Riverpod, and we'll define what kind of provider we want here. So we'll define app database, and then we'll have a function here which basically returns the instance which we want as a dependency. So here we'll do as this. So now we have defined a dependency, which is basically saying that we need an app dependency. So we have created this provider for that, and we are returning that by app database.get, the static method we use. Or if you have a different kind of dependency, you just create an instance like this and pass that. Now if you do like this, it depends on how do you use provider. It might possible that whenever this provider has been accessed, it basically create a new instance every time, which you don't want. So you need to be careful on how do you use it. But currently if we use app database.get, it will, since a singleton here, it's check for the instance, will use the same instance throughout the widget. Now since we have created this dependency, now Riverpod need a mechanism in order to manage all those dependency for us. So we need to wrap our whole app into called provider scope. So we basically wrap our full app inside the scope, and whenever you use this provider, it manages whole state and things around this scope. So we need to wrap around our whole app into private provider scope. Now we have created this provider. Now we need a way to consume this provider somewhere in the widget tree, and then use this instance to do the changes inside the widget. So to consume this provider, first we need to identify where we want to consume it. And basically, since we are starting a step-by-step process, we want to start with a place where we have 100% coverage or more coverage, so that we can verify that it's being migrated properly without breaking anything. So we'll use this provider for home screen for now. It's just to demonstrate that how you can migrate to a new state management solution screen by screen, where you first write your test and then you migrate each screen one by one. So here we'll start with the home screen. So how we can consume a provider or a dependency in the home screen. So if we go to the Riverpod documentation concept, and if you go to the provider, first it showcases that how you can or different type of provider you can create, like provider, state provider, future and stream and all. We have basically used simple provider here, and then now we want to read a provider, which is basically consuming the provider. There are multiple ways to read a provider, and I mean, one of the basic ones start with an ref object. Now how do you use and where do you use ref object? It also depends. For example, if you want to read from a different provider, you use a ref from a provider. If you want to read a ref from a widget, you use a consumer widget. And since this is a stateless widget, and for stateful you can use consumer stateful widget plus consumer state. And there are some other ways to use the hook and all, so we are not going to look into it. Our main focus is that since our home screen is stateful widget, we want to focus how can we use that provider with stateful widget. So if we go to the documentation, we can basically extend it with a consumer stateful widget and consumer state instead of stateful widget plus state. And if you see in this example, it's just a home view extending consumer stateful widget. Here it's a consumer state, and then you can get a ref object inside this and you can use to read that. So let's do it in our code base. So what I'll do is I'll just change this first to a consumer stateful widget, which will require here a consumer state. Now since we made this small change in the home screen, we need to make sure that we are not breaking anything. So what I'll do is I'll just rerun the test here. So let's rerun test to see if we have not broken anything on the home screen. So our all test passes, even though we have inserted this, nothing is broken. Now let's move ahead one step further. Now we don't want to use this app database. Instead we want to use the app database coming from the Riverpod, which is basically a provider. So what we'll do here is, instead of using this database, since this database instance being used around this home screen, what we'll do is we'll just replace it with a ref object, which we get from a consumer state because we are extending here as a consumer state. And then what we'll do is we'll just read. So there are multiple ways to read provider. There is also watch, which we'll cover later. So what we'll do is we'll just read from a provider, and what provider we want to read from is basically our app database provider. And since our app database provider return app instance, it doesn't give any compilation error and it just works fine. Basically we have migrated to Riverpod by simply doing this. So now let's just run our test to see if everything is working as expected. So as you can see now that only one test passed and 9 tests fail. So if we go here, we'll see that that home test here is failing because there is a no provider scope found. Now why does this happen is because since we are using this ref to read here as a provider, now when we run the home test, it's look for this ref, but as we have done in our main class, it required a provider scope first in order to manage all those states for Riverpod itself. Now when we go to our home test, we see that we are just wrapping it with this material app. It doesn't have the provider scope there. So what we need to do is we need to create that scope, similarly how we did with the wrap with material. So what we'll do is we'll just create a widget and I'll just name it wrap with provider scope and return provider scope with child this. So basically it will wrap anything into provider scope. Now let's just go to our home test here, and what we'll do is we'll just wrap this with provider scope. So I'll just find all the usage where it's been used and I'll just wrap it with provider scope. Now I have replaced everywhere wrap with material wrap with provider scope. Now let's just rerun the test. So few of the tests still passes, this and this, but still other tests are failing. Let's just check why is that. Okay, so here we are using a wrap with material, but we didn't replace with right scope. So I think I need to figure out where this navigated observer has been used and replace that with the scope. So I'll just use rapid provider scope, rerun the test. Now still there are some tests failing. Now you can see that from here that sometimes even you write test, it does not mean that it's always a safe option. We are using a new state management solution which required some initial setup to be done in order to run the test. The same thing we did with the wrapping with a material app, because we want to run our whole app inside a material app. That was a setup part of our test. So we are now changing all our tests which use the old setup to a new setup. So this might be the cost you need to pay off once you get started. Once you know how it works, it's just basically changing and replacing text all over the places. And this is also important that you start small. So currently if we have similar tests for multiple screen, all the tests won't fail because all of them are not using provider yet. Only the home screen which is being used is failing because we are using provider there. So this is how you can go step by step by picking up one screen at a time and just fix test for those screen and then move ahead. So now if we go to show task item, we see that now it's not giving any no provider scope error. I'll just check all the remaining test cases. So yeah, all the other tests which were giving the no provider scope are passing now, but now this test is failing. So let's see why. It says 0 widget with text task 1. So if I go into here, it's not able to find this text. If we dig more closely, we'll find that this task 1 should be coming from this fake app database. But now if we go to the home screen, we are passing the app database here, but we are not using it anywhere. We are just initializing it here, and if we try to find the usage, it only says it's being used here. The reason why is because we replace that usage from ref.read app database provider. Now what's happening here is this app database provider is actually reading the database, which is not work in a test. So now we need to figure out a way to replace this app database to our fake database. Now one of the reason I like provider is basically the ability to swap your provider very much easily in test. So how do we replace this fake app database with the provider app database? So let's just go to the testing part of it. So if you go to testing, it describes some do's and don'ts around how to do around this provider. Like no state should be preserved between test and test widget. So it gives some example on different kind of example how to do it. But our focus is basically that overriding the behavior of provider during test. So we want to change the actual app database from our fake one. So if you go into this test example, override repository provider, it shows that there is a method called overrider, and you can basically override your dependency with a fake dependencies. So in order to do this, first we need to have a mechanism to override this. So if we go to our test, we see that we are not wrapping the provider directly here, so we cannot override it here. We are just using this method, helper method, to do it. So in order to make those override, we need to make changes in this wrap with provider scope. Similarly, we did for this list navigator, that we pass some fake navigator into this material app. We need to do the same thing. We need to pass some fake providers here that can be replaced it here. So here it requires override, and if you see the type here, it's basically the override type. So what I'll do is I'll just copy that here, and as we did for above, I'll just keep it optional and I'll do that override here. So if some scope want to override it, they can use this, else it's just an option. It will do the empty array, similar to how we did with wrap with material app. Now I'll just want to make sure that I have not broken anything, so I'll just rerun the test so that the tests which were passing earlier should pass. So now it's passing. Now let's focus on show task item first. So how we can override is basically that we'll use the override here and we'll pass an array, And since we want to fake the app database provider, we'll just get that app database provider. We are able to access it here because it's been defined globally on main, so we can access it here. And then what we'll do is we'll just override with the value here, and we'll use our fake app database here, which we are using it. Now I'll just rerun this test. So now as you can see, the show task item list is passed because it's now using fake app database. Now we don't need this app database anymore because we are not using it. So now we can easily replace with like this. So I'll just rerun it to make sure it works, and yeah, it's working. So what I'll do is I'll just copy this thing here and try to replace it in other test. So for example, for filter here, I'll just replace it here, and I'll remove this, and I'll rerun the test again. Yeah, so similarly I can just copy this whole thing here. I can come down here, just replace it this here. I'll rerun the test again, and it passes. Now let's just go to the swipe one. So here, just replace it here, and I'll just rerun the test. So if you go to left to right, it's still failing because it was supposed to have task completed but still having null. So the reason why it's happening is because, so we are creating a fake app database here and expecting that here, but we are providing a different instance here. So this and this are different, so that's why this is failing. So what we need to do is here is, instead of this fake app database, we need to replace it with the one which we actually are doing our assert to. So now I'll just rerun it, and now it passes. I'll do similar thing for right to left as well. So I'll just rerun it. So now all the 9 tests are passing. I'll just rerun the whole test suite again. So earlier it was failing with the 9 test. I hope it will pass this time. So now all tests pass. So congratulations, we have been able to migrate one home screen to the new Riverpod app without breaking anything.
So is that it? Are we done with migration? No. So in the next video, we'll use some best practices for Riverpod and do some cleanup. So stay tuned for the next video. Thank you.
So if you like this video, then please like, share and subscribe. Thank you.